United Nations peacekeeping operations mandated by the Security Council of the United Nations. Canada, with only 0.5% of the world's population, provided more than 10% of all peacekeeping forces deployed throughout the world. More recently, that number has declined to, wait for it, less than 0.1% from a leadership position. And when you're strong at the United Nations and you're sitting in the Security Council, you can leverage that position into further strength internationally. The same way as if you've got open access to the President of the United States in the Oval Office, and a Ronald Reagan or a George Bush or a Bill Clinton will respond immediately. You leverage that internationally because all the other leaders know what's cooking. They see this activity and they're ready to collaborate with and to respond to Canadian initiatives because of the work that we are doing in these two great institutions, and the same applies to NATO. One Anthony Banbury, a retired U.S. Assistant Secretary General, wrote recently in the New York Times that the nostalgic image of the United Nations does not always conform with present-day reality. More in sorrow than in anger, Banbury dissected a litany of incompetence and gross misconduct ranging from peacekeeping fiascos in Mali and the Central African Republic, earthquake relief in Haiti, and the Ebola crisis. He lamented that thanks to colossal mismanagement, the UN is failing. Banbury urged UN reform across the board. When in office, as Stanley and Derek know, I called in our ambassador to the United Nations and I said, I want you to, on the 1st of January, to attend upon the Secretary General of the United Nations and give him a check from the Government of Canada prepaying all of our costs and our dues and our commitments for the subsequent year. And I did that to counter U.S. government foot-dragging in this regard, led by Senator Jesse Helms. Remember Jesse? And to show Canada's tangible support for the United Nations. I would now suggest that since Canada remains the 7th largest contributor of funds to the United Nations and its agencies, we should move beyond fuzzy sentiments and position ourselves in the vanguard of those seeking genuine reform at the United Nations, where my associate Paul Heinbecker served with such distinction. A complete overhaul of personnel policies and practices, along with much tighter accountability, should be a top-level priority. It's our money. We've got to make certain that this is properly used in the interests of the poor and those, les défavorisés du monde du tiers-monde. C'est ça qui est important. A substantial reconstruction of the Security Council to counter the drift back into Cold War paralysis is also in order. That being said, the dismal track record of the UN in recent years on peacekeeping and conflict resolution is not an excuse to walk away. It is a major reason why Canada should redouble our constructive efforts there. It is why our commitments to NATO need to be rejuvenated. We also need NATO because the brief holiday from history that came after the end of the Cold War is truly over. Geopolitical rivalries have resumed and the West faces major new threats. Canada is indulging in yet another defense review, one intended presumably in part to camouflage the fact that defense spending has fallen below 1% of GDP, well short of the 2% NATO pledge. This is not a criticism of the current government. They have been in office for less than 8 months, so they're not to blame. Canada's problem has been years, if not decades, in the making, and there's a lot of blame to go around. And I say that without partisan comment at all. This is too important for partisan comment. The simple reality is that if Canada expects NATO to do more, and we do, on global security, we must decide to do more for NATO. That should be a top defense priority. But we cannot talk about Canada being back in the world without making tangible commitments that will anchor our aspirations. The Honorable Tyrus W. Cobb was a distinguished West Point officer who served as an influential special assistant to President Reagan with national security responsibility for Canada. A few years ago, Mr. Cobb, now retired and living in Nevada, wrote an op-ed piece in the Nevada Appeal in which he mentioned a personal experience in the White House to illustrate a point. Quote, "When one gets his rear end chewed out by those he respects, it tends to make an indelible imprint. I recall one time when President Ronald Reagan was very upset with a memorandum I had written. He had developed a very close relationship with Brian Mulroney, the new Prime Minister of Canada, also of Irish descent. Within the administration, we had all come to love Mulroney, but most felt that Canadian efforts in the defense area and in support of us on foreign issues was less than what we had hoped for. Thus, Secretaries Caspar Weinberger and George Shultz, as well as the National Security Advisor, agreed that the President needed to be somewhat more demanding in the upcoming summit meeting with Prime Minister Mulroney. The day before the meeting, we gathered as usual in the Cabinet room for the pre-brief. Normally, the President would come in from the Oval Office carrying a jar of jelly beans and wearing a big Irish smile. After a long delay, he came into the Cabinet room with a big frown on his face and threw down his briefing paper on the Cabinet table, and looking directly at me, he said, "I want you to know that I don't talk to Brian Mulroney that way," unquote. He continues, "While I was mentally preparing for my anticipated shift back to West Point, the President kicked off the meeting, turning to the Defense Secretary by saying, 'Well, Cap, what have you got?' Weinberger, looking at his somewhat hardline notes that had been prepared, thought for a minute and said, 'Well, Mr. President, the good news is that in terms of defense spending, Canada has just surged ahead of Luxembourg.' That took the tension out of the room, and the President laughed. My job was saved, the summit went well, and the world didn't end." End of quotation. Why do I quote this? This is the type of private conversation that went on in the White House at the highest level at a time when Canada's contribution to NATO and the UN was significantly higher than it is today. Just imagine, therefore, what is being said in private about Canada's defense efforts in the corridors of power in Washington and other major capitals these days. Just imagine what they're saying. And that's what matters, not editorials in the Toronto Star who don't have a clue what's going on in the real world. Not at all. This is what is important. And given our track record, who can blame them for having that opinion? If we truly expect to rejuvenate NATO's role and relevance, our deeds need to match our words. We need forces that can engage in tasking by NATO, and we need new equipment for our troops to engage swiftly and effectively along with our allies. Defense may indeed be the easiest target for budget cuts, but we cannot expect to be influential in NATO or in the defense of our own continent if we persist at the puny level of less than 1% of GDP. That represents approximately $20 billion this year, the sixth lowest of all our major allies. Canada's contribution was approximately 2% during my time in office. We were less bellicose than some succeeding governments and talked less harshly about some situations. But obviously our contribution, I think, was probably more beneficial to our collective defense and international obligations than it was in later years. When it comes to defense procurement, it would be an understatement to suggest that we need a complete and absolute overhaul. Too many programs have been delayed, generating more and more expenditures with less results. The system for equipment selection and the decision-making process for procurement is gravely wasteful and inadequate and needs to be urgently revamped and streamlined. As I said, things happen. There's no partisan spirit in what I'm about to mention the example. It is there. It's a perfect illustration of what we're trying to do. In 1993, now listen to this very carefully. In 1993, my government announced the purchase of EH-101 helicopters to replace the aging Sea Kings. The initial purchase price was $4.4 billion. The Chrétien government canceled this order later the same year. Remember Mr. Chrétien in the campaign saying, I'm going to come in and I'm going to say no helicopters, and I sign, and there are no helicopters. Well, that's what he did. They canceled the order that same year, and he forgot to tell the Canadian people in advance that he would be paying $498 million of their money in penalties. Then he split the order in two, adding $500 million in extra expense. And 23 years later, the second half of that order has yet to be delivered, and the cost for that alone is already more than, wait for it, $7.6 billion. Meanwhile, to keep the venerable, we don't have the helicopters. 23 years later. Meanwhile, the venerable Sea Kings, to keep them flying, it takes 30 hours of maintenance for 1 hour of operation. So, can you imagine this extraordinary use of taxpayers' dollars, what we could have done as a country for the poor and the disabled and those who are trod upon? We need new fighter aircraft as well, but most of all, we need a decision on what we will buy to serve our strategic needs, not an interim purchase driven by political considerations that risks repeating the helicopter fiasco. To lead is to choose, and to choose is to decide. And that's what a prime minister has to do, and he should do. We need new ships too, not more studies. And surely the lesson from the ongoing submarine saga is that when you buy cheaply, you get what you pay for. I would simply suggest today that some serious consideration should be given to piggybacking, where possible, with strong allies like Australia.